إله إلا الله.
Mr. President, I would ask consent to vitiate the quorum call at this time.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. And Mr. President, I rise today to talk about our efforts to change the Senate rules. As we began the 113th Congress on January 3rd, Senators Merkley, Harkin, and I introduced a resolution to reform the standing rules of the Senate. 13 of my colleagues have signed on to co-sponsor our resolution. When we introduced the resolution, we agreed with the majority leader that it would be best to have the debate about reforming our rules after the inauguration. I appreciate his willingness to work with us on this important issue. And although we postponed the debate, we preserved the right of a simple majority of this body to amend the rules in accordance with Article 1, Section 5 of the Constitution. Senate Resolution 4, our proposal to reform the rules, is simple. It is limited and it is fair. Again, we are not ending the filibuster. We preserve the rights of the minority. Here's what we are proposing: an end to the widespread abuse of silent filibusters. Instead, senators would be required to go to the floor and actually tell the American people why they oppose a bill or nominee in order to maintain a filibuster. Debate on motions to proceed to a bill or to send a bill to conference would be limited to 2 hours. Post-cloture debate on a nominee other than a justice to the Supreme Court would be limited to 2 hours, rather than the current limit of 30 hours. These are sensible changes. These are reforms we are willing to live with if we are in the minority. And yet we are warned that these simple reforms will transform the very character of the Senate, will leave the minority without a voice. These arguments are covers for continued abuse of the rules. The reforms we propose are modest. Some would say too modest, but they would discourage the excessive use of filibusters. The minority still has the right to filibuster, but not the right of one senator to do so by simply picking up the phone, by simply making an announcement, and then going out to dinner, or more likely, out to a fundraiser. I've listened carefully to the arguments against these changes by the other side. Let me say again, we are not talking about taking away the rights of the minority. We are not talking about abolishing the right of debate or to filibuster. But there must be change. The abuse of the filibuster and other procedural rules has prevented the U.S. Senate from doing its job. We are no longer the world's greatest deliberative body. In fact, we barely deliberate at all. This does not honor this institution, and it does not serve the American people. For most of our history, the filibuster was used very sparingly. But in recent years, what was rare has become routine. The exception has become the norm. Everything is filibustered, every procedural step of the way, with paralyzing effect. The Senate was meant to cool the process, not send it into a deep freeze. Since the Democratic majority came into the upper chamber in 2007, the Senates of the 110th, 111th, and 112th Congresses have the 3 highest totals of filibusters ever recorded. Lyndon Johnson faced 1 filibuster during his 6 years as Senate Majority Leader. In the same span of time, Harry Reid has faced over 390. Lyndon Johnson, 1, Harry Reid, 390. Legislation is blocked at every turn. The result is not surprising. The Senate of the 112th Congress passed a record low 2.8% of bills introduced. That's a 66% decrease from the last Republican majority in 2005-2006, and a 90% decrease from the high in 1955-56. By every measure, the 112th Congress was the most unproductive Congress in our history. My Republican colleagues have come to the floor and made many impassioned statements in opposition to amending our rules at the beginning of this Congress. They say that the rules can only be changed with a two-thirds supermajority, as the current filibuster rule requires. They argue that any attempt to amend the rules by a simple majority is breaking the rules to change the rules. This is simply not true. The supermajority requirement to change Senate rules is in direct conflict with the U.S. Constitution. Article 1, Section 5 of the Constitution states, each House may determine the rules of its proceedings, punish its members for disorderly behavior, and with the concurrence of two-thirds, expel a member. When the framers required a supermajority, they explicitly said so, as they did for expelling a member. On all other matters, such as determining the Chamber's rules, a majority requirement is clearly implied. There have been 3 rulings by vice presidents sitting as President of the Senate, where you're sitting today, Mr. President. The vice presidents sitting in that chair, they have ruled on the meaning of Article 1, Section 5. In 1957, Vice President Nixon ruled that, quote, the right of the current majority of the Senate at the beginning of a new Congress to adopt its own rules, stemming as it does from the Constitution itself, cannot be restricted or limited by rules adopted by a majority of a previous Congress, end quote. Vice Presidents Rockefeller, Vice President Humphrey made similar rulings at the beginning of later Congresses. The Constitution is clear, and there is also a long-standing common law principle upheld in the Supreme Court that one legislature cannot bind its successors. Many of my Republican colleagues have made the same argument. For example, in 2003, Senator John Cornyn wrote in a law review article, just as one Congress cannot enact a law that a subsequent Congress could not amend by a majority vote, one Senate cannot enact a rule that a subsequent Senate could not amend by majority vote. Such power, after all, would violate the general common law principle that one parliament cannot bind another. So amending our rules at the beginning of a Congress is not breaking the rules to change the rules. It is reaffirming that the U.S. Constitution is superior to the Senate rules. When there's a conflict between them, we follow the Constitution. Some of my colleagues may believe that the Constitution and using the Constitution in this way would be harmful to the Senate. But there is an alternative. We don't have to reform the rules with only a majority vote. Each time the filibuster rule has been amended in the past, a bipartisan majority of senators was prepared to use the constitutional option. But with a majority vote on the reforms looming, enough members agreed on a compromise, and they passed the changes with two-thirds in favor. We could do that again. I know many of my Republican colleagues agree with me. The Senate is not working. As I visit with my Republican colleagues on the other side of the aisle here, they tell me they're unhappy with the way things are. I said 2 years ago that I would push for the same reforms at the beginning of the next Congress, regardless of which party was in the majority. At the time, many people believed the Democrats would lose their majority. So let me be clear. If Leader McConnell had become the new majority leader in this Congress, I would have asked him to work with me on these same reforms. I will say again, the proposed changes will reform the abuse of the filibuster. They will not trample the legitimate rights of the minority party. I'm willing to live with all of the changes we are proposing, whether I am in the majority or the minority. The other side has suggested that a change in the rules is an affront to the American people. But the real affront would be to allow the abuse of the filibuster to continue. We have to change the way we do business. We have to govern. It is time for us to pay attention to jobs and the economy and the things that matter to American families, the things they talk about around the kitchen table. That was the message that was sent us from this election, and we would do very well to listen to it. Under the abuse of the current rules, all it takes to filibuster is one senator picking up the phone. That's it. Doesn't even have to go to the floor and defend it. Just a phone call by one senator. No muss, no fuss, no inconvenience, except for the American public. Except for a nation that expects and needs government that works. A government that actually works together and finds common ground. Maybe some of my colleagues believe that the Senate is working as it should, that everything is fine. Well, Mr. President, we do not take that view. It isn't working, and it needs change. The American people of all persuasions want a government that actually gets something done. The challenges are too great, the stakes are too high for a government of gridlock to continue. And, Mr. President, I would ask consent. The New York Times today and several of the local newspapers in my home state have editorialized about moving forward with reform and how important that is, and I would ask consent to put those in the record.
Without objection.
And let me just recognize I have three of my colleagues here on the floor that are senators who have just been elected. And I think one of the best things about this new class of senators who are coming into the United States Senate is they've studied this issue. They understand this issue. They've been out there with the American people and listened to them. And the American people are demanding change. And so it's a real pleasure to see today on the floor and the presiding officer, the senator from Hawaii, the senator from North Dakota, and also the senator from Maine. And I know that shortly we'll be going into our caucus and having a very lively debate about which way to move forward, how we do reform. I'm convinced we are going to reform these rules. I hope we do it, working with our colleagues on the other side of the aisle. But if they will not come with us, we are in a position where we're in the majority, and we have to make this institution work for the American people. And with that, I would note the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
A quorum call on the floor of the Senate, and as we wait for a senator to come to the floor, we'll go back live to Washington National Cathedral for more of the inaugural prayer service.
be seated. Mr. President, Madam First Lady, Vice President, and Dr. Biden, honored guests, leaders in government, in the business community, and the religious community. It's a privilege to be with you today and to be sharing, especially on the occasion of the second inauguration. Over the last 2 weeks, I've been praying a lot. God, what would you have me say to these remarkable people? And the first thing I felt God wanted me to say to you was simply thank you. Thank you. A friend of mine once told me, he said there are 3 reasons why people seek public office. The first is there are some who want to feel important and they want all that power affords them. He said there's a second group, and those folks are just a little off in the head. But he said there's a third group who really want to make a difference. They really want to change the world for the better. And I believe that represents you and all of you in this administration and in leadership in our country. Now, we Americans say it seldom, but we should say it far more often. Thank you for giving yourselves, for sacrificing, for living in glass houses, for accepting the constant barrage of criticism with very little praise, for being willing to risk everything in order to serve this country. Thank you. This month marks, as you all know, the 150th anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation. Abraham Lincoln is known as the Great Emancipator, but as I was thinking about scriptures to reflect upon, I thought of the biblical emancipation story. And the great emancipator there was a man named Moses. Now, as we reflect on Moses' life, I'd like to lift up 3 ideas from his life, from his journey and leadership that might speak to all of us today as leaders in our country, and I hope in some way speak in particular to those of you who are in the highest authority in our land. And I begin first with the heart and the character of Moses. Now, there are 2 things we learn about Moses' heart and character in the Scriptures. Numbers tells us that the man Moses was a humble man, more humble than anyone else on the face of the earth. God chooses and uses those who humble themselves before Him and before others. Young Mary, the mother of Jesus, in her Magnificat says that God scatters the proud in the thoughts of their hearts, but lifts up the lowly. Jesus teaches the same thing when He turns to His disciples who were arguing on the night before He would be crucified which one was the greatest. And He says to them, you don't understand. That's how the kings of the world operate, but that's not how you operate. He said, the first among you, the one who would be great, will be your servant. And then He washed His disciples' feet. Now, Moses' humility was coupled with a deep compassion and courageous concern for the marginalized and the oppressed. He was raised in Pharaoh's palace. He had everything a man could possibly want. But when he saw the plight of the Hebrew slaves, he could not remain in silence, and he could not remain in the palace. Ultimately, he risked his life to stand before Pharaoh and to demand that Pharaoh release the slaves. And he led them into the wilderness towards the promised land. This is what God looks for in the Scriptures from every king, every rabbi, every leader. He looks for those who will take seriously the call to justice, to do kindness, to speak up for those who cannot speak up for themselves. James says it this way: true religion and undefiled before God is to care for the widows and the orphans. And Jesus says at the last judgment, it all comes down to this: how did you respond to the needs of the least of these? Now, this is America at her best. At our best, we're a humble people, and we remember the call to have compassion for the least of these, which is why Emma Lazarus' magnificent poem is etched inside the Statue of Liberty with these words: give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to be breathed free, the wretched refuse of your teeming shore. Send these, the homeless, tempest-tossed, to me. I lift my lamp beside the golden door. Humility and courageous compassion for the marginalized and the oppressed are central to the heart and character of Moses, and are meant to be central to the heart and character of this nation. The second thing we learn from Moses is the importance of having a vision. Professor John Cotter, now retired from Harvard Business School, noted that two of the most important tasks of any leader are to cast a compelling vision for the future and then to inspire and motivate people to pursue it. That vision has to be a clear and compelling picture of where we want to go, our preferred picture of the future. Moses led the slaves out of Egypt, but that was not enough. Very quickly they grumbled and began to desire to go back to Egypt, where there were leeks and cucumbers to eat. It was at least safe there. The wilderness was hard. Moses had to constantly remind them of the vision. He said, we're marching to the promised land, a land flowing with milk and honey, where we can worship freely, where we can love, where we can practice justice, where we can live in harmony. A compelling vision unifies us. It excites us. It leads people to a willingness to sacrifice and imbues them with a sense of purpose. Cotter suggested that the average American company struggled with a lack of vision, a compelling vision at least. As a pastor, I can tell you the same is true of local churches, congregations across the country who don't remember their purpose, and they no longer see a compelling vision for the future. And sadly, this feels true of America today. With our two-party system, vision casting often feels like mere political rhetoric, and we typically are offered two different visions competing with one another, not one unifying vision. To many Americans, we feel like a house divided that cannot stand. We find ourselves desperately longing to find common ground, to find a common vision, to be one nation, indivisible, with liberty and justice for everyone. In this city and in this room are the people who can help. This may be, this bringing together our country, a more important issue than anything else you face. Because until we resolve our differences here, or at least find some unifying vision that brings us together, we're going to find it very, very difficult to solve any other problems we're facing. Debt ceilings, issues of health care. Proverbs notes this: without a vision, the people perish. They don't literally perish. They just bicker and fight and become so polarized they can't get anything done. We're in need of a new common national vision, not one that is solely Democratic or solely Republican. We need at least one or two goals or dreams that Americans on both sides of the aisle can come together and say, yes, that's what it means to be American. That's where we need to go. God has given you a unique gift, Mr. President. Unlike any other president we've ever had, you have the ability to cast vision and inspire people. You should have been a preacher. God actually has you exactly where God wants you. And yesterday you began to lay out a vision for us in your inaugural address that was very powerful and compelling. Somewhere we've got to find and forge one or two dreams or visions that people on the right and the left, the Republicans and Democrats, have come together to say, yes, we can stack hands on this. Even just one or two. And you pointed to that. You hinted towards that yesterday. We have to remember our picture of the promised land. And when we do that, anything is possible in America. I offer one small example of the power of vision from the church that I serve in Kansas City. One of our visions at the church is to address the root causes of poverty in Kansas City so that our city might look more like the kingdom of God that Jesus preached about. And when we began to ask, how do you address the root causes of poverty, what we learned is the one thing everyone agrees upon is early childhood education. And so we had a vision that we would work together with the public schools in Kansas City to find a way to give the 2,284 children in 6 elementary schools where 90% of those children are on the free or reduced lunch program a chance for a better future. We partnered with these schools and we came in and we said, we don't have the answers, we just offer ourselves as servants. What do you need? How can we help? This last year, 2,500 of our members volunteered in the schools. We built playgrounds at all 6 of those schools where they didn't have playgrounds before. We repainted the inside of the schools where they didn't have money to fix the schools. Our members volunteered as tutors to read to the children. We purchased 20,000 books and gave them to the children so that they might read at home. When we found out that 1,400 children were coming to school on Monday hungry over the weekend because they didn't have the reduced lunch program at home, We started providing backpacks for children with nutritious snacks every Friday, 1,400 of them that our members pack and then deliver so these children come back to school Monday fed. When we learned that 300 children sleep on the floor or on the couch in their homes, we provided 300 beds. We delivered them. We provided sheets and blankets and pajamas for these children. On Christmas Eve, our biggest night of the year at our church, we voted a number of years ago to give away the entire Christmas Eve offering to projects benefiting children in poverty. And we challenged our members, would you consider giving an amount equal to what you spend on your own children at Christmas in this offering? We give half of it to projects benefiting 1,000 orphans in Medici, Malawi, and half of it to the projects benefiting the 2,284 children in Kansas City. And on Christmas Eve, our folks in one evening gave $1,235,000 to these projects. I mention that not to brag, though I'm very proud of our congregation, but to say that's one congregation with one vision. And that unifies us as a church. We're Democrats and Republicans in our congregation. We're left and right, conservative and liberal, but somehow these kinds of visions pull us together into the future. And they excite, and they help change the world. The last word I'd mention regarding Moses is that despite great opposition to his leadership, and despite feeling discouraged many times, he never gave up. To be a leader is to invite criticism. If you're a Sunday school teacher, they'll criticize you. If you're a supervisor at McDonald's, they'll criticize you. If you're a preacher, they'll criticize you. And I don't know how you're still standing. It was not long after Moses began to lead the children of Israel out of Egypt that they began to grumble against his leadership. 4 years in, they disliked his policies so much, a number of them tried to vote him out of office. It was a close vote, but somehow he managed to keep his job. In Numbers chapter 11, we read that he went out into the wilderness. It's a wonderful and endearing story of Moses. He goes out to the wilderness, and he lifts up his hands and he prays, God, just kill me now. I don't want to do this anymore. It is too hard. But this was one time God did not answer Moses' prayer. And instead he said, in essence, get back to work. I need you. I'm reminded of the night in late January 1957 when Dr. King received a threatening phone call. His children were asleep. His wife was asleep. This wasn't his first threatening phone call. Since the Montgomery boycott, there had been many. But on this night, as his children and wife lay sleeping, he felt he couldn't go on. He began to think of a way to gracefully bow out of leadership of the movement. At midnight, he bowed over the kitchen table and he began to pray. I'm afraid, Lord. The people are looking to me for leadership. And if I stand before them without strength and courage, they too will falter. I'm at the end of my powers, God. I have nothing left. I've come to the point where I can't face it alone. And then he describes something interesting that happened next. He said, I experienced the presence of the divine as I had never experienced God before. It seemed as though I could hear the quiet assurance of an inner voice saying, stand up for righteousness. Stand up for truth. And God will be at your side forever. Imagine how the world would be different today if Dr. King had bowed out of leadership because it got just too hard. Had he not stopped to pray that night and to seek God and to feel God's reassurance? The theme of this year's inauguration was faith in the future of America. But in this service, we come together to acknowledge that in order for America to have a future, we'll first need to find a deep and abiding faith in God. It is this faith that calls and compels us to humility and compassion and concern for the nobodies. It is this faith that helps us discover the kinds of visions that are worthy of our great nation and worthy of the sacrifices we can make. It's this faith that sustains us when we feel...
Madam President, I ask that the quorum call be vitiated.
Without objection.
Thank you, Madam President. I'm rising today to talk about the vision we have ahead for the next 2 years and how this United States Senate can fulfill its responsibilities under the Constitution to do its legislative responsibilities, addressing the big issues facing America. Now, I don't think anyone is unaware that the last 2 years this chamber has seen simply inaction and paralysis. It's been rated as one of the worst 2-year sessions in the history of the United States government. Well, what are we going to do differently? How is it that we only addressed 1 out of 24 appropriation bills over the last 2 years? How is it that so many important bills never made it to the floor of the Senate? Bills such as the replacement for No Child Left Behind coming on bipartisan vision out of committee. How is it that so many bills came to this floor to never see a final vote? The Disclose Act, which would have eliminated secrecy in campaign donations. The DREAM Act, which would have honored creating a future for those who know only America as their home. The President's Jobs Package, which would have helped put America back to work. The closing of loopholes for the biggest, most wealthy oil companies. Those funds could be put to use reducing our deficit or funding critical programs for working Americans. On issue after issue, we saw inaction. And what we heard yesterday at the start of this next 2 years was a call from the President for action. He said in his inaugural speech, "For now, decisions are upon us, and we cannot afford delay. We cannot mistake absolutism for principle or substitute spectacle for politics or treat name-calling as reasoned debate." He continued, "We must act, knowing that our work will be imperfect. We must act, knowing that today's victories will be only partial." The President echoed, if you will, the thought that he brought into his first 4 years, the urgency of now, that we have big issues facing America, and it's time for the executive branch and the legislative branch to work together to address those issues. Well, in this call for action, we must ask, how much action can there be if we see more than 100 filibusters in the next 2 years? How much action can there be if on every request for a vote an objection is heard that creates a day of delay in this Senate? The contrast is enormous from the time that Lyndon B. Johnson was President of the Senate. Lyndon B. Johnson, during 6 years presiding over this body, saw 1 filibuster. And Harry Reid, in his 6 years presiding over this Senate, has seen 391 filibusters. And let me convey that even when you have the votes to end a filibuster, the fact that it is launched creates enormous paralysis. Imagine you're debating a bill, and you continue debating through the end of a week, and you come in the following Monday and you debate, and nobody has anything left to say, so someone says, "I ask unanimous consent that we have a final vote on this bill." Now, you see, we don't have a previous question motion on this floor, so one has to ask for unanimous consent, meaning any of 100 senators can weigh in and say no. And when they weigh in and say no on that Monday, then on Tuesday, a petition is put forward with 16 senators saying, let's have a vote on closing debate. And that vote can't happen until Thursday under the rules. And if it's successful on a Thursday, you have to have 30 hours more of debate before you can hold the final vote. That takes you into Saturday. So Monday through Saturday is lost based on an objection on Monday by 1 senator. If you have 391 of these objections that waste a week of our time in the course of a 6-year period, then you basically waste every legislative week, because there are not 391 weeks in a 6-year period. Well, it becomes pretty simple to see why we only got 1 appropriation bill done in the last 2 years, why so many bills never made it to the floor of Senate for consideration, even though they were essential to restoring the economic vitality of our nation and putting people back to work. And I, for one, find this absolutely unacceptable. There have been, over our history, 3 basic forms of filibusters. Now, the first only worked in an age when transportation didn't work very well, and at any given moment, there were a number of members that couldn't get here to the floor of the Senate because they were traveling from their farm and their axle on their wagon broke or the train broke down or so on and so forth. Sometimes those journeys would take many weeks, and things happened along the way. In that situation, a quorum of 50% plus one was sometimes in doubt. And those seeking delay could say, you know what, let's deny a quorum. Well, that was an effective tool only through that early period. And then, as that changed, folks said, you know, we have the respect here of hearing everyone out. And therefore, if I can get the floor of the Senate, I can delay this Senate as long as I'm able to speak. Well, it's through this effort that we have a number of famous filibusters. Folks like Strom Thurmond holding forth for 24 hours. We have, however, seen that a person can only delay the Senate for 24 hours, then someone else can seek the floor, and you can proceed. So that was a fairly modest strategy. Now, in both the case of the denying quorum and in the case of speaking as long as you could, you had to spend time and energy, you had to organize, and it was visible before this body. It was visible before the reporters gathered in the balcony. Therefore, the American people, long before there was a television camera here, could see what you were doing, and the public could provide feedback on that. But now we come to the modern era, from 1970 forward, in which it became popular to start using the objection as an instrument of party warfare, the objection to a final vote. Now, if we turn back before 1970, you had an overlap between the parties of perhaps 30 members. And so if one had used this objection, they would have a good sense that you'd be able to get cloture. Furthermore, there was a social contract that you only interrupted the workings of this body on an issue of deep principle. You only blockaded the operations of the Senate on an issue of profound concern to your state, not as a routine instrument of party politics. But that's changed over the last 45 years, since 1970 forward, last 43 years, in which the minority party has said, let's show the majority can't even get an agenda onto the floor of the Senate, and then let's complain about them not acting. You know, this is not a philosophy that serves America. It's not a philosophy that was embraced through the extent of our history. You came here with the responsibility to contribute in committee, to contribute on the floor, try to make bills better, try to get issues addressed, not try to paralyze this body so issues don't get addressed so you can campaign on that side. That, quite frankly, is an unacceptable theme that has started to haunt this hall, and we need to do something about it. Indeed, if you look at the modern era where the parties have become so divided, you no longer see that overlap of 30 senators. And therefore, any minority group, be it the Democrats, be it the Republicans, has the ability to bring this chamber to a halt. But is it right to do so? And if we cannot persuade our colleagues it is wrong to do so, then we need to change the rules of the U.S. Senate. We need to say that if you are going to take and throw a shoe into the gears, if you're going to blockade the ability of the Senate to deliberate and decide, then you need to take responsibility here on the floor of the Senate. Yes, we should get rid of the filibuster on the motion to proceed. Filibustering on whether to get to a bill does not enhance deliberation on the bill itself. We should make that decision in a crisp fashion and get on to the work, not waste weeks trying to decide if we're going to do the work of the people. Second, we should get rid of the filibuster on going to conference committee. Both chambers have decided. They have voted in favor of a bill. It's been passed in different forms. Nothing should impede getting to conference and having a negotiation. Indeed, out of those negotiations, even if you're starting with one chamber with one dramatic view different from the other, is a coming together that may take steps forward that both chambers can agree to. Nothing should impede that negotiation from going forward. Recognize, a bill can still be filibustered when it comes back from committee, so why would you impede getting to conference committee in the first place? And yes, we should greatly reduce the number of hours after we have gotten cloture on debate. Nominations, by the time folks vote on closing debate, they know how they're going. Our members know how you're going to vote on that nominee. So have a final 2 hours, but not a final 30 hours. 30 hours is another wasted set of days that we can ill afford to waste. And certainly it does make sense to say whenever possible we should cut down that 30 hours on bills after we've reached cloture. We can do it by unanimous consent and often do now. We can do it by requiring folks to proceed to a vote if they don't stand and talk, but that's post-cloture. But here's the thing. When 41 senators say they want additional debate, they want to delay the decision-making process here in the Senate, then they should be willing to stand and make their case before their colleagues and before the American people. Now it takes time and energy if you go that direction. It doesn't become a freebie that one senator spending no time, no energy, who can go off to dinner, who can go off on vacation, can paralyze the Senate. No, now you have to spend the time and energy to be here to make your case. And not only is that important in stripping away frivolous filibusters, but it means the American people get to weigh in. I'm absolutely convinced that if we were going back to the debate on the Disclose Act, which stripped away secrecy in campaign donations, we had 59 votes to close debate. We needed a 60th. And so those who voted for additional debate fled this chamber fearful of making their case before the American people. If they had had to stand and defend secrecy and foreign donations in our campaign system, the American people would have said, not that you're a hero, but you're a bum. They would have weighed in and said to their own senators, join the effort to close debate. Because to stand in the way of a final vote over secrecy and campaign donations does great damage to our democracy. And maybe the pressure and common sense of the citizens would have helped address the bitter partisanship that divides this body. At a minimum, the citizens of this nation have the right to know what is happening to legislation here on the floor. The idea that it is being paralyzed by this secret filibuster is unacceptable. So we should include the talking filibuster in any package that we bring to modify the rules of the Senate. I see my colleague from New Mexico has come to the floor, and he spoke earlier. He has taken and put forward the vision that we must, at the start of every 2 years, evaluate how the Senate is working. And if it has problems, we need to pass changes in the rules to address those issues. And this is not some remote concept of inside baseball. This is about American citizens having a legislature that can address the big issues facing our nation. So I praise him for his leadership in putting this forward that has led to this day, the second time. We were here 2 years ago making this case, making this argument that we owe it to our citizens to improve the workings of the Senate. And we're here again today. There is a saying about the U.S. Senate that the Senate is the world's greatest deliberative body. If only it were so. It has been, at various points in its history, a thoughtful chamber, a deliberative chamber, but not today, driven by deep partisan differences and those being converted into strategies of paralysis that prevent deliberation. We must change that. It is our responsibility as senators to change that. The American people expect it. Let's make it so. Thank you, Madam President.
Madam President?
Senator from New Mexico.
Madam President, if I could ask unanimous consent to engage in a colloquy with my friend from the Senator from Oregon.
Without objection.
Thank you, Madam President. And once again, let me just say at the beginning here, it's a real pleasure to see my old Attorney General colleague, now the Senator from North Dakota, Heidi Heitkamp, in the chair, presiding over the Senate, and also to see the Senator from Maine, Angus King, here. The new senators, and I think Senator Merkley would agree with this, the new senators bring an energy to this that we don't necessarily have. And we're 4 years from our last campaign. We ran in 2008. And I just love hearing their stories and what they've heard and how they've visited with people in town hall meetings. And the American people get this, Senator Merkley. I don't think there's any doubt. They really, really get this. I know you've done a number of town halls on this issue. I just hope as we have the chance to discuss this both in our caucus and on the floor and with other senators that we can capture the energy of the senators who have arrived here and have been out with the people in their states, with their constituents, and what they bring to this. But Senator Merkley, I was going to ask you, I know you, among many of the senators, do regular town hall meetings. And I've also done a number in my career. Is this something that this kind of rules change, is this arcane? Is it people don't understand it? Or they're saying, why are you bothering with procedure? Or do people get it? Do they get it in Oregon when you're in a meeting?
To my colleague from New Mexico, I would say they most adamantly get it. In fact, I had 13 town halls 2 weeks ago in conservative parts of the state, in more liberal parts of the state, and in every setting, from conservative to liberal, folks said, please, please continue this effort to address the filibuster and the paralysis. And the simple notion behind the talking filibuster, that if you as a senator are voting for more debate, that is to delay the workings of the Senate, that you should be making your case on the floor so that they get to see what's going on and they get to decide whether they support it or oppose it. Just resonates. It's the way folks think the Senate worked, and they often think the rules changed and required it in the past and not now. And it's a chance I have to explain to them that really the social contract has changed, that when people objected to the Senate proceeding with its business in the past, they wanted to make their views known on the Senate floor. They wanted to take responsibility because they realized it was a very high privilege to be able to delay the Senate and that they had a responsibility to do so only for deep principle or large issues and to make their case known. So I see overwhelming support. I feel like the American people are so far ahead maybe of our own chamber in understanding how broken we are and how much it needs to be fixed.
Senator Merkley, also, you said some nice comments about me. You were probably a little too generous, but I'd also like to thank you for all the work that you have done on this issue. You have been a passionate voice for change, and you and I have both reached out to our friends across the aisle and tried to get things done. And one of the things that I always bring this back to is, why are we doing this? We're doing this so that government can tackle the issues that the American people really care about. And I think there are 2 times in history, I'm sure there are many others, where, for me, the Senate was in its glory days. And we should always remember we have that potential. We see little bits of light every now and then here with the passage of a transportation bill or a farm bill out of the Senate. We're bipartisanship and we come together. But the glory days of the Senate, just to talk very briefly about 2, one was before the Civil War. In the 40 years before the Civil War, the Senate was grappling with, how do we hold the Union together? And there was tremendous discussion, and senators like Daniel Webster and Calhoun and others would work with each other and have heated debate. But for that 40 years before the Civil War, they held the country together. And it was the Senate that fashioned those compromises that allowed the country to stay out of a civil war. They didn't completely prevent it, but most people looking at history say those were some of the glory days of the Senate. And the second period was in the 1960s and 70s with senators like Muskie and Stafford and Chafee, giants in this body who stepped forward on civil rights, stepped forward on environmental issues, stepped forward on the pressing issues of the time. And so the Senate once again in that time period passed laws. I remember I was a kid here in Washington. My father was Secretary of Interior. The Wilderness Law, Clean Water Act, Clean Air Act. We set up the Environmental Protection Agency. I mean, these were big laws, big, bold laws that were dealing with our problems. So once again, glory days of the Senate. And I think we have that potential. As I see the new senators coming in, the folks that were elected with us, the senators that have arrived in the last 5 or 10 years, I think we have the ability to respond in a big, bold way to the crises that face us. And I know, Senator Merkley, you came here a young man with Senator Hatfield, I believe, and you saw a different Senate. Maybe you could talk about that. And we don't want to stay. I know we're going to a caucus, and we have our generous chair here, so we don't want to keep her up there too long, our presiding officer. Anyway, Senator Merkley, I yield.
Well, I think my colleague from New Mexico is absolutely right in pointing out that there were periods when the Senate really worked to address the big issues facing America. And it wasn't that there weren't profound differences. There were fierce differences, emotional differences, deep differences. But folks came to this floor, they conversed, they laid out their arguments, and ultimately they made decisions about which way to go. And they didn't bring the attitude, well, let's just paralyze this chamber from doing nothing. Had they done that, it would never have been the set of changes that address significant issues in either of those periods. My colleague is right. Part of the reason that I feel so strongly about restoring the functioning of this Senate is when I came here as an intern at 19 for Senator Hatfield, I had the very good fortune to be assigned to the Tax Reform Act of 1976. And then I had the even better fortune that it came up on the floor of the Senate. So during the many days that it was before this body, I sat up in the staff gallery and watched as amendment after amendment was raised and debated and voted on. And in those days, since there was no camera and there was no email, the member of the Senate team that was responsible for it would run down from the staff gallery, intercept your senator, explain to them what the issue was, what had been said about it, what folks back home thought about it, what the state set of motions that had been done on it. And it was a legislature at work. And rarely did the thought that anything would not be decided by 51 pass the minds of the Senates. Again, that was something reserved, that objection to 51 reserved for very special occasions, very rare occasions that you might do once or twice in your career. I do feel like the conversation we have before us is so important, and I thought I'd put up this chart. This just dramatizes, my colleague can see it, but it's a picture of Lyndon B. Johnson showing his one filibuster in 6 years, one time that he needed to get a cloture petition to try to shut down debate. Otherwise, there was a courtesy, and people said what they had to say and then stood aside and took votes. And here we have Harry Reid in his 6 years, says 387 and counting. Well, it hit 391 before we completed his sixth year. And so enormous difference. And the work that we're engaged in right now of trying to find a way to have every voice heard and then to be able to proceed to be accountable and transparent before the public is so important. I would note that sometimes as you and I have engaged in this conversation, we've heard criticisms from across the aisle saying, you're trying to silence the voice of the minority. Do you see anything in the proposals that we've been advocating for that in any way silences the voice of the minority?
In looking at this, I do not see anything in the proposals, and I think we, in working this together, tried to bring a discipline to it that said we want to preserve the best traditions of the Senate. We want the minority to be heard. We want the minority to be able to have amendments, and we want them included in the process. What we don't want is the tyranny of the minority. And the founders talked about the tyranny of the minority. They talked about the fact that if you allowed a small minority to govern and block the governing of the majority, that was the tyranny of the minority, and they feared that. And so I think when we consider this and we talk about the filibuster and our institution today, our United States Senate, where many times the Republican leader has come to the floor and said, it's going to take 60 votes. Everything takes 60 votes. Well, that isn't the way the founders designed it. The founders had actually very strong language for what they thought of supermajorities. Everybody remembers their history. The founders came off the Articles of Confederation. It was a supermajority. It didn't work. It was broken. And so they only put into the Constitution in 5 places supermajorities, things like expelling a member and ratifying a treaty, but otherwise simple majorities. And now how this happened, it's hard, when the history is going to be written, it's hard to tell, but to have a leader of the Senate stand up and say everything takes 60 votes. Well, the founders never contemplated that. When they adopted Rule 22 in 1917, that wasn't what they were trying to do, and the rule has actually been turned upon its head. So with that, since I initiated the colloquy, I'm going to yield the floor at this point,
Madam President.
Senator from Oregon.
I'm glancing to see if any of my colleagues would like to say anything at this point. I just want to follow up on the last point that Senator Udall, colleague from New Mexico, made about our founders. I have in my hand 3 of the Federalist Papers. Federalist Paper 22, number 75, number 58, and these are by Madison and Hamilton, and they explore this issue of the supermajority. It was a very conscious decision that a supermajority was not put into the Constitution for decisions of these chambers. And the reason why, they explain it more eloquently, but is essentially that if you take the path that the minority thinks is the right path, rather than the path the majority thinks is the right path, then over time you make a series of worse decisions. The minority might be right on occasion, but most of the time the viewpoint brought by those representing the greatest number of states in this case, or the greatest number of citizens on the House side, is a path that makes sense. And they warned about the supermajority as an instrument that would bring paralysis. It's almost like they could look forward 200 years to this moment and say, don't do that because you'll end up with paralysis. This is from the Federalist Paper number 22 by Alexander Hamilton. He wrote this in 1787. And he notes, in commenting about the issue of simple majority or supermajority, he says, there is commonly a necessity for action. The public business must, in some way or other, go forward. If a pertinacious minority can control the opinion of a majority, respecting the best mode of conducting it, the majority, in order that something may be done, must conform to the views of the minority. And thus, the sense of the smaller number will overrule that of the greater and give a tone to the national proceedings. Hence, tedious delays, continual negotiation and intrigue, contemptible compromises of the public good. Let me read that last set of words about what Hamilton said would happen if you had a supermajority requirement in the U.S. Senate. Tedious delays, continual negotiation and intrigue, contemptible compromises of the public good. I think anyone watching the proceedings of the Senate over the last 2 years would say that Hamilton was right on the mark in that regard. And of course, he was not alone. There was not a single Federalist paper written arguing that there should be a supermajority in the Senate or the House because of the experience that had been had previous to forming the strategy embodied in the Constitution. So let's turn to James Madison. James Madison said, "It has been said that," and this was Federalist 58, "it has been said that more than a majority ought to have been required for a quorum." And he goes on to discuss it in various views. He says, "Lastly, it would facilitate and foster the baneful practice of successions, a practice which has shown itself, even in the states where majority only is required, a practice subversive," and here's the key language, "a practice subversive of all the principles of order and regular government, a practice which leads more directly to public convulsions and the ruin of popular governments than any other which has yet been displayed among us." And he also made point that you would end up with equitable sacrifices to the general weal or general good. So as we turn to our conversations in our respective caucuses and to the dialogue here on the floor of the Senate, I ask my colleagues to search your hearts about our responsibility to the citizens of the United States of America to address the big issues facing America, which means that we don't paralyze this body in secret. If you have points to make, then do them, as was done during the periods of great debate in the floor of the Senate. Make them on the floor of the Senate. Engage in that debate. And when no more is to be said, when all 100 senators say we have had our full input, then let's make a decision. Madam President, I yield the floor and ask that we recess.